We're going to be exploring how we can do fetch requests, the differences between a fetch request and using async and await, how you can get the data, and then also how you can make a fetch request, catch errors, output the content once you retrieve the data. And if you have multiple URLs, such as we do here in this case, where we can make multiple fetch requests, output to the data into the console, and then lastly, how we can use an array of URLs, make fetch requests, and then as we map the results back as a giant JSON object, then we can loop through that data and output it onto the page. So that's what we're going to be covering in this lesson. Got an index file with one element that's got a div with a class of main, a JS file where we're going to be writing our JavaScript code, and also several JSON files that contain some data that we're going to be requesting using JavaScript. So first off, let's select our element that we want to write the content into for the AJAX request, and that's going to be going into the element with a class of main. So using the document and then query selector, we're going to select the element with a class of main. So this will give us a place to type content and add content into. You can also console log it out just to make sure that you do have the element selected properly. And once you do see it within the console, that means that we're ready to interact with it with the JavaScript code. Also, we want to add in a button on the page. I'm going to add that directly within the main element. So using the document, we're going to create an element, and the element that we're creating is going to be a button. So when we press the button, we're going to load the content. I'm also going to create another element, and this is going to be where we're going to write the content into. So we're adding both of these elements into the main element. So this one will be a div, and this is where we're going to create our interaction for our page content. So let's go ahead and we're going to add them into main. So first off, we're going to append the output, and then we also want to, from the main, and append the button element on the page. So going into our code, within the HTML code, we should see that now we've got the buttons are added. So within the elements and the body and under main, there's the div, there's the button that have been added to the page. Now that we have the elements on the page, let's attach the event listener. And the one that we want to attach is to the button. We're going to add an onClick event. So whenever the button gets clicked, then we're going to run the function. And this function is going to connect to the JSON file and the JSON data using a fetch request. I'm going to add them within the URLs. So create an array. And within this array, this is where we're going to have all of the web URLs that we're going to be connecting to, as we're going to be connecting to several JSON files. So we do have 3 of them. They're all app6-1, 2, and 3. So adding them in as URLs will allow us to select that and loop through that. So let me just update this. And now we can select the web URLs that we want to connect to. And of course, this is located on the same directory as the index and the JavaScript file. If you do have a different path to the JSON file, you got to make sure that you do have the correct path for it to connect to. So now that we are connecting, we can get a response back. So using fetch, and we're going to select within the URLs using the index value of 0. So select that first URL and make a fetch request whenever the button is clicked. Let's add some text content to the button so that we can see the button. Get data, we'll add that to the button. So now when we click the button, and this is outputting a response, and what right now we'll just output the response back into the console, so we can take a closer look at what's being retrieved back within the response. And we see that we do get a promise that's being sent back. So the fetch method by default just returns a promise, and then you can use that promise with the then or the catch. So because we do have the response back, we can handle the response, or we can catch errors with fetch. So let's do that, where we're going to be using the fetch method. We'll connect to the same URL, which is going to be the first item that we have within the URLs list, and then handle the response back using then. And so this is going to be returning back the response object, and then we can do something with the response object here, where we're just console log that out for now. So that's going to be adding the response object, and then we can also chain together a catch. And what catch will do is this is allow us to catch any errors and if there are errors, then we can handle the errors. So for now, we'll just output the error out into the console. So if there are any issues with the connection, when we make the connection, we see that we did make the connection. It returns back a body with data used okay. So we get some stats back here, and we've got the status text. So what we want to do is we want to actually get the content out of the response object, and we can do that by chaining together and returning back the response object. And there's a few different methods that are available. So when we return this, it's going to automatically send the response back into the next stage of the promises. And we can chain together another promise, and this is where we can actually capture the data that's being contained within the end result of the response object. So send that through. And what right now we're getting an undefined, and that's because we have to return back the response text. So try that again, and that gives us the JSON data, and it's contained within a text object. And there's also a JSON method that allows us to return the data back into a usable JavaScript object. And with the arrow format, we can shorten this a little bit by automatically just returning back what we get back within the JSON. And then within here, we can use the curly brackets if we have additional context that we want to make use of. So that way we're able to get back the text content. There's also with fetch. So if you do want to practice using the async and await with fetch, it's going to look like this, where we can set the async, and that's going to run the function. And I'll just call it fetch data. And once we do get a response, so we can return back the response object. So using await, and this is where we make the fetch request to the response object, and we're going to use the same URL. So it's going to be using the index value of 0. So once we do get the response back, that's going to return the response back. And if we want to get the data, we'll add in an await. And once we get the response, then we can use the response, and we'll use it as text. And within the console log, we'll output the data. So this is going to run both of those functions and outputting within the console the data content. So here we still have to invoke the fetch request. So we need a way to make the request for the fetch request. So let's go ahead, and we're going to add that function in whenever the button is clicked. And we can actually move this out and have it as a function on its own there on the global scope. So both will work the same way. And we can also update this one to be JSON, and that actually should be REP so that it matches the variable that we're using. And now we're returning back both of those values. So we can just as well also do an onClick for the fetch data and run it within the async and await. So those are some of the options that we have when we're using the fetch request and using the async. Also with the fetch request, if we want to make multiple requests, so let me just set up, I'm going to set up another function here, and this will be fetch. I'll call it fetch now. And what this will do is this function is going to also run whenever the button is clicked. So that way it's making both of those requests, and we've got both of those functions sitting on the global scope. Let's go ahead, and we're going to create a few more buttons on the page. So I'll give these ones button 1, 2, and 3, and then we'll make some updates to the buttons on the page. So we've got button 1, 2, and 3. And then for the button text, we'll get the button 1, button 2, button 3. So this first one is going to be use fetch. The second one is going to use, and then the last one is going to be PromiseAll example. So setting up the first one, and this one is going to just get the fetch now. So run the function to fetch now. So that's our first button there. Second button is going to use the fetch data for the async. So there's the first button, there's the second button. And also, once we've got the data, let's output some content into the output area. So we'll load the content into the output area. So instead of going within the console log, we'll do the text content and output the text content. So because this is going to be within an object format, we can get the data first, and then also output the data last for the values that are contained within the object, and do the same thing for the fetch now. So this has to be contained within then, so that this is where, once the response has been received, this is where we can output the content. So both of them are going to be fetching, and you can even update some of the endpoints so that we do get different data. Now let's attach another function to button number 3, and this is going to be fetch. So I'll call it fetch all URLs, and we'll create that function in order to handle the fetching of the URLs. So this is another example, and in case you do need to make a fetch request to a bunch of URLs, you can use the Promise.all, and the Promise.all will allow you to loop through a bunch of items and make requests to all of those items. And because these JSON files are only changing slightly, within the Promise.all it's expecting an array, and then this array would have where we're making the fetch request. So let's add those in first. We're making the fetch, and then this is the response JSON data, and we'll chain together one more value there, and that's going to be getting the content as data. Or we can just keep this as the response for the fetch, and we'll add in all of the URLs separately. And I'll show you another way that we can do this that's going to simplify this request. So this is within an array. So this is expecting our array-based response. And then once we do have all of the content back, then we can output some content into the console. So we'll just console log. So if we console log the results, that gives us the results from all of the requests and outputs them into the console. So if we did want to add them to one particular object and then use that object and output the content, we can do that as well, where within the fetch all, and let's create another function to manage that. So this is just one example where we're just outputting into the console log all, and I'll just call it and rename this to. So instead of having the promise all, what we can do is we can promise all and we can map the results and then do something with the returned results. So picking up using the map of the array contents. So we know that the array contents are within the URLs. So let's make an update to this where we're going to use the promise all, but we're going to use the URLs array within the promise all. So this gives us all of the URLs that we want to use. And then using the map method, we can get the URL out and then do something with the URL where we can make a fetch request to the URL specifically and then return back the response from the response object as JSON and output that into the console log. So this is a shorter way of doing that because we already have everything within an array, and this is where we can use the PromiseAll and also the map. So just need to have one more rounded bracket there to close off the function. And let's actually get rid of the curly brackets there, and then we can try that out. So the PromiseAll now is going to be returning that back, and this saved us the trouble of having to write fetch because we already have the fetch URL within the URLs, and as we loop through the map and we get the URL out as a URL, then we can use that to make the fetch request and return back the object data. So we can also extract that as data and then console log out the data object and output that into the console. Now let's take this one step further where we'll wrap it with the rounded brackets, and then here we can have a function that's going to loop through the data object where we're getting data and then for each, and we can do something with each one of the items within the data, and we'll console log out each one of the items as we loop through. So that outputs each one of the items because now we have it within a data object. And now we can select and we can update it into the output area. as we iterate through, we can update the text content of the output area with whatever value we have there. So let's construct that. And we'll create some HTML. And then as we iterate through for the HTML, we can add to it. And this is going to contain the contents of the output that we want to have. So let's set that up, and the same as we just did with the other examples, except the data object is going to be within a variable called val. So now we can output those on the page, and then once it finishes looping, we can set up and we can set whatever the output text content and assign a value to it. So this is actually going to be the inner HTML, as I'll add in some HTML into the HTML variable. So opening and closing the divs. And now when we do PromiseAll, it lists out all of the items from the list. And I can also get the index value here, wrap it with the curly brackets, and we can also include the index value. So do an index +1. And now when we do all, that will make a request and return back all of the data into one object that then we can make use of within the page. So that's how you can make multiple fetch requests using the PromiseAll method in JavaScript and bulk all of your data together and then use it. And the key here is that the data is structured within the same way. So these data objects are very simple. They have the first and last name as the keys and then the values that are associated with those items. So go ahead and try it out and list out the items from a JSON file and then also from multiple JSON files. And you'll be ready to move on to the next lesson.